Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to explore something both powerful and deeply actionable: how to transform your life in 1 year, using what I call a 1-year success plan. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't about vague motivation or lofty goals. This is about leveraging what we know from neuroscience, psychology, and behavior change to create real, measurable progress in your life. The human brain is hardwired for growth, but it doesn't respond well to randomness. It responds to structure, feedback, and consistent input over time. What we're talking about today is a structured plan that taps into that system. A plan that uses deliberate daily actions, clear vision, and neurobiological principles such as dopamine-driven reinforcement and the science of habit formation to engineer success over the next 12 months. This isn't about hacking your life, it's about understanding how your brain actually works and using that knowledge to shape the life you want, one day, 1 week, one goal at a time. Clarity is one of the most underappreciated forces behind real transformation. When we talk about transforming your life in 1 year, what we're really talking about is the cumulative effect of thousands of micro decisions. These decisions are shaped by what you focus on, and what you focus on is determined by your level of clarity. Without a clearly defined goal or vision, the brain defaults to familiar patterns. It leans on the path of least resistance, avoiding uncertainty and discomfort. But when clarity is high, the brain gets a signal: this is important, this matters, direct resources here. From a neurological standpoint, clarity is not just a psychological concept, it's a biological directive. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for planning and decision-making, requires a target. Think of it like a GPS system. Without an exact address, you'll keep moving but never arrive. That's why vague goals like be healthier or do better this year are rarely effective. They activate a minimal response from the executive networks in the brain. However, a clear goal like lose 15 pounds by December 15th through strength training and nutrition tracking engages multiple neural systems, including goal mapping circuits, dopamine pathways, and even motor planning regions, which together create traction and direction. Clarity creates what neuroscientists call attentional bias. When the brain is clear on what it's looking for, it filters the environment differently. You start noticing opportunities, resources, people, and patterns that align with your goal. This isn't just psychology, it's biology. The reticular activating system, RAS, plays a key role here. It sits in the brainstem and acts as a filter between your conscious awareness and the massive influx of sensory data you're exposed to every second. When you define what's important, the RAS begins tuning your perception accordingly. You quite literally start seeing the world in a way that aligns with your objective. There's also a strong connection between clarity and motivation. Dopamine, the molecule of motivation and pursuit, is released not just when you achieve goals, but when you anticipate them and believe they are attainable. The clearer your goal, the more your brain can simulate the pathway to success, and the more dopamine you release in the process. Vague goals don't produce that effect. Specificity, on the other hand, allows the brain to rehearse success and generate a sustained motivational signal. That's why clarity is not a passive idea, it's a fuel source. Clarity also helps reduce cognitive load. When you wake up each day unsure of what matters, your brain expends energy in decision-making, prioritizing, and trying to choose among endless possibilities. This mental fatigue adds up, often leading to procrastination and distraction. A clearly articulated vision acts like a filter. It simplifies decisions. You know what to say yes to and what to ignore. This conservation of cognitive energy means you can apply more focused effort to what actually matters. Over time, this translates into significant compounding returns. Another key benefit of clarity is emotional regulation. When people feel overwhelmed, anxious, or stuck, it's often because they lack direction. The brain doesn't just want movement, it wants meaningful movement. Clarity provides context. Even difficult tasks or delayed gratification feel purposeful when tied to a clear vision. The anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in conflict monitoring, becomes more efficient when goals are well defined. This means your brain is better at resolving internal friction and maintaining emotional stability in the face of setbacks. You become more resilient, not because you're more disciplined, but because your mind knows exactly what it's working toward. Clarity also builds confidence. When your actions align with a clearly defined goal, you get feedback. That feedback loop, effort, result, adjustment, reinforces your sense of agency. Over time, this sense of control becomes confidence, And that confidence amplifies your ability to stay consistent even when motivation fades. The brain likes feedback. It thrives on tracking progress, but you can't track what you haven't defined. That's why the most powerful first step in any transformation is not action, it's direction. In sum, clarity is not optional, it's foundational. If you want to radically change your life in 1 year, the first non-negotiable is defining exactly what that change looks like. Not just in abstract terms, but with real, measurable, time-bound specificity. Because when the brain knows where to go, it will begin wiring the system's perceptual, motivational, emotional, and behavioral to help you get there. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change itself based on experience. It's not just a scientific term, it's the fundamental reason why transformation is possible at any age, in any circumstance. For years, scientists believed that the brain was relatively fixed after childhood. But now we know with certainty that the brain remains malleable throughout life. What this means practically is that every thought you focus on, every behavior you repeat, every habit you form, they are all shaping the architecture of your brain in real time. When we talk about transforming your life over 1 year, we're not talking about wishful thinking or surface-level change. We're talking about using the principle of neuroplasticity to intentionally rewire the way you think, act, and respond to the world. This is not motivation for the sake of feeling good. This is science-based methodical adaptation. Your brain is plastic, it changes based on what you do repeatedly with focus and intensity. But it doesn't change passively. It changes in response to focused, repeated input. There are 2 core types of neuroplasticity, Hebbian plasticity and homeostatic plasticity. Hebbian plasticity is often summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. This means that when you repeatedly activate certain neural circuits, they grow stronger, more efficient, and more automatic. For example, if you practice gratitude each morning, not just think about it, but feel it and focus on it, the neural pathways involved in emotional regulation and positive perception strengthen. Over time, this becomes your default mode of thinking. Similarly, if you routinely engage in avoidance, procrastination, or negative self-talk, those pathways strengthen as well. The brain doesn't judge what's useful or not, it simply wires what you do repeatedly. Homeostatic plasticity, on the other hand, refers to the brain's drive to maintain balance. When certain circuits are underused, the brain weakens or prunes them. This is just as important as growth. If you want to transform your life, you must be as intentional about what you remove as you are about what you build. Eliminating distraction, reducing time spent in reactive or emotionally draining states, and stepping away from inputs that keep you passive are all forms of pruning that make room for higher functioning circuits to thrive. Another critical factor in neuroplasticity is attention. The brain doesn't change based on what you do automatically, it changes based on what you do with intention and awareness. This is why practices like journaling, meditation, and focused work are so effective. They bring attention into the present moment and amplify the signal your brain receives. Repetition without attention leads to stagnation. Repetition with attention leads to transformation. Your nervous system takes cues from where you place your focus, and over time, it builds neural scaffolding around those inputs. There's also a neurochemical side to this process. Acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter involved in focus and learning, is released when you engage in new or difficult tasks with high attention. This molecule flags circuits for change. Dopamine also plays a role. It signals to the brain that a particular behavior or outcome is worth repeating. When you make small progress toward a meaningful goal and feel good about it, dopamine is released, reinforcing the behavior. Together, acetylcholine and dopamine act like sculptors, carving out the mental pathways that define how you think and act in the future. Sleep is another non-negotiable component of neuroplasticity. It's during deep sleep, especially in stages 3 and 4 of non-REM sleep, that the brain consolidates learning. Neural circuits that were activated during the day are replayed and strengthened. Without quality sleep, the plastic changes you worked for don't stick. The same goes for stress management. Chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol, which over time can impair neuroplasticity, particularly in regions like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. If your goal is to reshape your life, managing stress and prioritizing recovery are not luxuries, they are part of the neurological process of change. It's also important to understand that discomfort is often a sign that plasticity is occurring. When you stretch beyond your comfort zone, when you challenge yourself to stay consistent in the face of resistance, When you adopt new routines that feel awkward or unnatural, that's when the brain is working hardest to adapt. Many people interpret this discomfort as failure or misalignment, but in reality, it's a signal that your nervous system is in the process of rewiring. Neuroplasticity doesn't guarantee change, it simply makes change possible. The key is intentional input, repeated with consistency, supported by the right neurochemical and physiological conditions. What you practice is what you become. If you understand how the brain adapts, you can structure your days, habits, and focus in a way that literally reshapes who you are over time. Motivation is an emotional state, and like all emotional states, it fluctuates. Some days motivation is high, you feel driven, focused, and ready to take on anything. Other days it fades without warning, leaving you disengaged or distracted. This is why relying on motivation alone is a flawed strategy for long-term change. What sustains progress is not how motivated you feel, but the systems you have in place to act regardless of how you feel. Daily systems create structure. They provide a framework for behavior that operates independently of mood or emotion. Systems are stable, motivation is not. A system is a repeatable set of actions aligned with a specific goal. These actions are performed consistently, often at the same time or in the same context, and over time they create momentum. When the brain is presented with consistent routines, it begins to allocate resources more efficiently. Neural energy is no longer wasted on decision-making or overcoming resistance. Instead, the brain adapts by automating the process. This is how habits are formed, not by force of will, but by the repetition of behavior in predictable contexts. Once a behavior becomes part of a system, it requires far less cognitive effort to sustain. From a neuroscience perspective, systems reduce what's called frictional load. Friction is the resistance you feel when starting a task or continuing through discomfort. Every time you hesitate, debate, or deliberate on whether to act, you introduce friction. Systems bypass this. They create what behavioral scientists call pre-commitment structures, meaning the decision has already been made in advance. You don't wake up and decide whether to exercise or journal or plan your day. The system already contains that decision. This frees up willpower and mental bandwidth, which are both finite resources. The brain thrives on predictability. It seeks patterns. When your day contains reliable patterns of action, the nervous system becomes calmer, more efficient, and more focused. In contrast, erratic behavior and inconsistent routines activate the stress response. Cortisol levels rise, focus narrows, and energy becomes scattered. Daily systems regulate your internal state by providing a rhythm. This rhythm becomes a kind of internal metronome, allowing your brain and body to anticipate effort and recovery in a balanced cycle. Over time, this balance supports higher levels of cognitive function, emotional regulation, and long-term resilience. Another powerful benefit of daily systems is the ability to generate small wins consistently. These small wins create a feedback loop. Each time you complete a planned task, no matter how minor, your brain registers a sense of accomplishment. Dopamine is released, reinforcing the behavior. This isn't about tricking the brain. It's about engaging the brain's natural reinforcement system through deliberate action. The more your brain experiences this feedback loop, the more it begins to associate those behaviors with reward. Over time, this creates intrinsic motivation, the kind that is sustainable. Systems also increase self-trust. When you follow through on your commitments to yourself, even in small, seemingly insignificant ways, your brain begins to build a sense of internal credibility. This matters because self-doubt is one of the primary drivers of procrastination and inconsistency. When you can rely on your system, you don't need to rely on how you feel. You've created a foundation that holds you accountable, not by force, but by design. This leads to greater consistency, which leads to real, measurable progress. Another important aspect is that systems allow for adaptability without losing structure. Life is unpredictable. Disruptions happen. Motivation disappears. But when you have systems in place, you have something to return to: a baseline, a routine, a framework. Systems create resilience. They are like scaffolding for your goals, holding things in place even when your emotional state is unsteady. The flexibility of systems lies in their design. You can scale them up or down, but the structure remains. That structure is what keeps you moving forward when everything else feels uncertain. It's also worth noting that systems reduce decision fatigue. The average person makes thousands of decisions each day. Many of these decisions are small, but they accumulate and deplete mental energy. Systems automate many of these choices, allowing you to conserve cognitive energy for the tasks that actually matter. When you're mourning your workday, your exercise, your learning, your downtime, when these are all guided by systems, you spend less time reacting and more time executing. Systems are not about rigidity. They are about reliability. They create a consistent environment in which transformation can occur. By showing up each day and engaging in deliberate, repeatable actions, you create compound change. One workout, one focused hour, one healthy meal, one journaling session, these are small actions in isolation. But when repeated within a system, they rewire the brain and reshape your identity. You become someone who follows through, someone who doesn't need motivation to act, someone who builds their life on discipline and design rather than mood or impulse. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the chemical of pleasure, but that's not entirely accurate. In reality, dopamine is the molecule of motivation, pursuit, and drive. It's what propels us to act, to move toward goals, and to repeat behaviors that lead to desirable outcomes. When it comes to creating a one-year success plan, understanding how to leverage dopamine becomes a crucial part of the process. If you can manage your dopamine system wisely, you can stay motivated over the long term and build habits that are intrinsically rewarding. The brain releases dopamine in anticipation of a reward, not just when the reward is received. This anticipation is what energizes action. When you visualize a future outcome, achieving a goal, reaching a milestone, transforming some area of your life, your brain begins releasing dopamine in preparation for that pursuit. The clearer and more emotionally charged that vision is, the greater the release. However, the critical insight here is that the dopamine response is strongest when tied to progress, not just the final result. If you only allow yourself to feel good when the big goal is achieved, you're teaching your brain to delay gratification indefinitely, which can lead to burnout and demotivation. A more effective approach is to learn how to reward progress. This means shifting your internal narrative to appreciate the small wins, finishing a workout, completing a focused work session, making a healthy food choice, showing up consistently even when it's hard. Each of these actions, when paired with a sense of accomplishment or internal recognition, reinforces the neural circuits associated with goal-directed behavior. When you acknowledge your effort, dopamine is released, and that reinforces the behavior in your nervous system. This is why habit trackers, daily logs, and reflection rituals are more than productivity tools, they're reinforcement mechanisms. They help bring awareness to your progress and allow your brain to register success at a granular level. That registration is what keeps motivation alive. Without it, the brain receives no signal that the behavior is working, and motivation begins to decline. It's not enough to keep grinding forward without feedback. The brain craves evidence that effort leads somewhere. When you celebrate progress, you provide that evidence, and dopamine helps encode that learning. There's also a powerful concept in neuroscience called dopamine layering. This refers to the tendency to attach dopamine to both the outcome and the stimulus associated with it. For example, if you only feel good when you check off a goal, but you hate the process of getting there, you create an unsustainable model. But if you learn to enjoy the process, the effort, the challenge, the discipline, then dopamine becomes layered across both the journey and the destination. This dual reinforcement system increases the likelihood that you'll stick with your behaviors long enough to see real transformation. One way to cultivate this is to mentally frame effort as a reward. Instead of thinking, I have to do this, you train yourself to think, this is how I become the kind of person who succeeds. When effort becomes part of your identity and not just a means to an end, dopamine is released more consistently because your brain perceives value in the act itself. This doesn't happen automatically. It requires conscious reframing, deliberate awareness, and repetition. But over time, it creates a powerful shift. You no longer need motivation to act because the action itself becomes rewarding. It's also essential to avoid overloading your dopamine system. In modern life, we are surrounded by high dopamine stimuli: social media, junk food, entertainment, constant novelty. These sources create spikes in dopamine without requiring effort, which can train the brain to expect reward without action. Over time, this reduces sensitivity to dopamine and makes real effort feel less rewarding. To counter this, it's useful to practice what's known as dopamine fasting, or more accurately, reducing passive dopamine hits. This means intentionally limiting easy pleasures and instead engaging in activities that require effort for reward. This recalibrates the brain and increases the motivational drive toward meaningful goals. Sleep, sunlight, and physical movement also play critical roles in dopamine regulation. Deep sleep helps reset dopamine receptors, making the brain more responsive to reward. Morning sunlight increases dopamine production by stimulating the retinal cells connected to areas of the brain responsible for wakefulness and drive. Physical activity increases dopamine and other neurotransmitters that support focus, mood, and motivation. These physiological levers are simple but highly effective tools for managing your dopamine system, and by extension, your energy and consistency. The goal is to build a system where progress itself becomes pleasurable. When you align your daily actions with a clear vision and consistently reward the small wins, you begin to train your brain to crave effort, not just outcomes. You create a self-sustaining loop of motivation where each step forward fuels the next. You're not just chasing a result, you're reinforcing a process, wiring your nervous system to pursue, persist, and adapt over time. Stress is often framed as something purely negative, something to be avoided or eliminated. But from a neuroscience perspective, that view is incomplete. Stress, when properly managed, is not only necessary but also beneficial for growth, adaptation, and long-term performance. The key lies in how stress is interpreted, regulated, and integrated into your daily system. Not all stress is created equal. There's acute stress, which is short-term and often tied to specific challenges, and there's chronic stress, which is long-lasting and can be harmful if not managed. The goal is not to eliminate stress entirely, but to use acute stress as a tool and avoid falling into patterns of chronic, unmanaged stress. At the biological level, stress triggers the release of hormones such as adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. These chemicals prepare the body for action, heart rate increases, attention sharpens, and energy becomes more available. In small doses, this response enhances focus and performance. It mobilizes resources and makes the brain more alert. But when stress becomes continuous and unregulated, the same hormones begin to have a degrading effect. They interfere with sleep, impair decision-making, and reduce the brain's capacity for neuroplasticity, which is essential for learning and change. One of the most powerful tools in managing stress is understanding the difference between threat and challenge. The brain interprets stimuli based on context. When you frame a difficult task as a threat, something that could lead to failure or embarrassment, your stress response becomes defensive. This type of stress narrows focus too much, reduces creativity, and activates avoidance behavior. However, when the same task is framed as a challenge, something that could lead to growth or mastery, the stress response becomes adaptive. The body still gets energized, but the brain remains open, resilient, and ready to learn. This cognitive reappraisal is a skill that can be developed through conscious reflection and mindset training. Breath control is another highly effective tool for regulating stress in real time. Short, shallow breathing patterns are associated with anxiety and can amplify the stress response. In contrast, slow, deliberate exhalations engage the parasympathetic nervous system, which promotes calm and recovery. One of the most immediate ways to downshift from high stress to a more centered state is through physiological sighs, a deep inhale followed by a second shorter inhale and then a long, extended exhale. This breathing pattern has been shown to reduce autonomic arousal and bring the body back into balance within moments. Movement is also crucial. Physical activity helps metabolize the chemical byproducts of stress and rebalances the nervous system. Regular exercise, especially cardiovascular training, has been linked to increased resilience to stress and better baseline emotional regulation. Movement doesn't just release tension, it signals to the brain that the challenge has been met, that it's safe to recover. This physical feedback is essential for resetting the stress response and creating space for mental clarity. Sleep plays a foundational role in stress management. During sleep, especially deep non-REM sleep, the brain performs a kind of emotional triage. It processes and integrates the events of the day, reducing the emotional intensity of stressful experiences. Without sufficient sleep, the brain's ability to regulate stress diminishes sharply. The amygdala, a region involved in emotional reactivity, becomes hyperactive, while the prefrontal cortex responsible for reasoning and control becomes less active. This imbalance makes it more likely you'll interpret neutral situations as stressful and respond with exaggerated emotional reactions. Social connection also acts as a buffer against stress. Human brains are wired for connection, and meaningful social interaction reduces cortisol levels and enhances emotional stability. Even brief conversations with supportive people can reset your internal state. In contrast, isolation amplifies the effects of stress, creating a feedback loop of anxiety and withdrawal. This is why regular check-ins, accountability partnerships, or simply maintaining consistent social habits can play a powerful role in building stress resilience. Nutrition and hydration are often overlooked but have a direct impact on stress regulation. Blood sugar crashes, dehydration, and nutrient deficiencies can all trigger or intensify stress responses. Maintaining stable energy through whole foods, regular meals, and proper hydration supports hormonal balance and brain function. This allows the nervous system to respond to stress with greater flexibility and recover more quickly afterward. Mental framing and cognitive habits determine how you interpret and respond to challenges. The stories you tell yourself about who you are, what you're capable of, and how life works either amplify stress or neutralize it. One of the most effective long-term strategies is to build a practice of cognitive reframing. This involves recognizing distorted thought patterns, challenging them with evidence, and consciously choosing perspectives that empower rather than paralyze. Over time, this builds what psychologists call a growth mindset, a belief that abilities and intelligence can be developed through effort, strategy, and persistence. This belief fundamentally changes the brain's response to stress. Stress, then, is not something to be feared, but something to be mastered. It can serve as a catalyst for action, a signal for change, and a tool for adaptation. When properly managed, stress becomes fuel, not a barrier for transformation. The nervous system is designed to handle pressure in cycles, with periods of activation followed by deliberate recovery. The more you understand and work with these cycles, the more control you gain over your internal state, your performance, and ultimately your outcomes. Accountability is one of the most powerful levers for behavior change, and yet it's often overlooked in personal transformation efforts. At its core, accountability is about creating conditions where your intentions are matched by action consistently and over time. It introduces an external or structured internal mechanism that holds you to your commitments, even when your motivation, energy, or focus wavers. From a neuroscience and behavioral science perspective, accountability works because it leverages social and cognitive wiring that evolved to prioritize follow-through, status, and alignment with one's stated identity. Human beings are inherently social creatures. Our brains are wired to respond to social feedback, approval, disapproval, recognition, and expectation. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for planning, decision-making, and self-control, is highly sensitive to these social cues. When you make a public commitment or share your goals with someone you respect, you activate this part of the brain more strongly than when you keep intentions private. The pressure to stay congruent with what you've said out loud creates a sense of internal alignment. This is not about fear or shame, but rather the desire for coherence between intention and identity. When you declare who you want to become and others witness it, your brain starts to structure behavior around fulfilling that narrative. This is also why coaches, mentors, and accountability partners are so effective. Their presence introduces regular checkpoints, which signal to your nervous system that performance matters. These check-ins raise the perceived stakes of your daily actions. Even the anticipation of reporting progress or the lack thereof activates the brain's executive function centers. This sharpens focus and reduces procrastination. The brain begins to prioritize tasks that are aligned with the goal because it now perceives a social cost to failure and a social reward to follow through. Accountability also reduces cognitive load. When you build systems that track your behavior, whether through journaling, digital logs, or shared metrics, you offload the burden of memory and self-monitoring. Instead of constantly wondering whether you're on track, you have real-time data. This allows for faster feedback loops. Your brain thrives on feedback, especially when it's specific, timely, and actionable. Feedback tells you what's working, what's not, and where to adjust. Without feedback, your nervous system becomes disoriented. It doesn't know if the effort is meaningful, which leads to fatigue and disconnection from your goals. There's also a deep link between accountability and identity. Every time you follow through on a commitment, especially one that has been externally declared, you strengthen the neural circuits associated with self-trust. You become someone who does what they say they're going to do. This sense of integrity is not just a character trait, it's a neurological pattern. The more you act in alignment with your declared goals, the more the brain builds a self-image that matches. This creates what's known as identity-based motivation. Rather than relying on willpower, you start to act based on who you believe you are becoming. The feedback loop of action reinforcing identity and identity reinforcing action becomes a powerful engine of change. Digital accountability tools can be effective when used properly. Habit trackers, task managers, and streak counters create visible markers of consistency. These tools give you a sense of continuity, a visual representation of progress that the brain responds to with reward-related dopamine release. However, it's essential that these tools are tied to meaningful goals. When accountability becomes performative or disconnected from your core values, it loses its effectiveness. The brain senses the dissonance and begins to disengage. Accountability only works when it's grounded in authenticity and aligned with your deeper purpose. Self-accountability, when cultivated skillfully, is just as powerful as external accountability. This involves developing a system of internal check-ins, daily reflections, weekly reviews, monthly recalibrations. Neuroscientifically, this process strengthens the medial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in self-awareness and future planning. When you engage in regular reflection, you teach your brain to project forward, evaluate behavior, and course-correct with precision. This is not the same as rumination or self-judgment. Productive reflection is structured, intentional, and always directed toward action. There's also a hormonal and emotional component to accountability. When you succeed in meeting a goal, even a small one, and it's recognized either by yourself or others, the brain releases serotonin and dopamine. These neurochemicals reinforce confidence, motivation, and emotional balance. Conversely, when you fail to meet a goal and there's no feedback or consequence, the nervous system often defaults to shame or avoidance. This is why compassionate accountability is so important. It creates an environment where failure is met with curiosity and adjustment, not self-rejection. The strongest forms of accountability are values-based. When your goals are connected to your core values, growth, health, creativity, contribution, accountability becomes a form of honoring your principles. It's not just about staying on track, it's about living in alignment. This deeper connection activates the brain's motivational and reward systems in a way that transcends simple task completion. It turns every action into an act of integrity. Over time, this reshapes not just behavior but identity, reinforcing the transformation you set out to create.